branding is so important. And what I thought was brilliant, and I'm not sure how you sold it to the radio stations. I'm sure you were very persuasive, but I think a large part of, especially at the beginning, is the imaging you guys created for classic rock. And if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it a bunch of cassette tapes on top of each other, Eagles, the Cars, what have you? I mean, who came up with that, and how important do you think imaging and branding was at the beginning?
Well, here we go again with focus groups, which is, to this day, my go-to way of learning. I mean, all the focus groups we did among classic rock fans informed my thinking about what was important, what people valued, what buttons to push, that kind of thing. And believe it or not, when these formats would sign on in the market, one of the typical reactions that you'd get from new fans would be, it's like you broke into my house and stole my record collection or my cassette collection or CD collection, whatever it was.
Right.
So people would say that all the time. We would run those promos on the air. And so when it came time to actually put together, it was actually an ad, and it was Chotto Hill. Do you know Chotto?
Yeah, I remember
right.
that.
Chotto's a local Detroit agency guy, and Chotto had done a lot of the work for WNIC back in the Jim and Jer, Harper and Gannon years. Brilliant guy, just absolutely brilliant, really collaborative, a lot of fun. And Chotto and I sat down to kind of figure out, all right, how was I going to market classic rock? And one of the depictions was these cassettes. And so and I think, one of them was like homemade stuff, and there was a Bob Seger cassette and
right.
all that. But it very much was a reflection of that kind of emotional vibe that people got listening to these stations for the first time. So it was a great sync-up. Honestly, Ron, it has been an easy format to market because the music is so damn powerful. And part of what I learned that I didn't really understand, two things. One is the power of nostalgia. I had some appreciation
Yes.
of that before, but not like I do now. But the other part was the realization of how great this music really was. I mean, I kind of looked at the music that became, classic rock, and I thought, well, you love that stuff because you grew up with it. True, I do love that stuff because I grew up with it, but you know what? That stuff's going to be around 100 years from now. I mean, people will be listening to Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, and they'll know who Eric Clapton was and all that. And I mean, there's not too many periods in music where you can say that. So that was the lucky part, growing up at the right time with the right music, and that music being so incredibly powerful that it could transcend the years. Big piece of it, yeah.
That's amazing. And so here's another question I want to ask you, because when I think of classic rock, it's definitely evolved over the years. And you obviously remember the first couple stations that flipped to the classic rock format. But can you talk about when you realized that this had a life of its own, and that it was being kind of morphed all over the country because it got huge, it got big real fast, it reincarnated bands like the Eagles. It just was like a fuel of fresh air. But when did you realize, okay, I think we're good, this is taking off? Or did you ever think that?
Well, I mean, I'm a paranoid programmer by nature, so you never think you're home. You don't want to get too full of it. But the format marketed itself after a certain point. I mean, people called me. I didn't have to market anymore, and so from that standpoint, it was cool. The painful part, and believe it or not, it was a painful part, is that the format really took down some great radio stations and some great markets. I mean, there were some big stations like Riff that didn't survive, that a classic rock station came in and literally decimated these stations. And the record labels were very unhappy with me because, to a great degree, competing with a classic rock format generally meant playing less new music at the rock station. And so a lot of the record label people were really upset. I was a pariah, and I never thought of myself that way. I always thought, hey, I'm just a nice guy who works in radio. Right. And all of a sudden I was this demon, who was destroying new music out there, and it's like, wow, how did this happen? So, I mean, for every wonderful thing that happened, I mean, there were also those kind of sobering moments, but really for the first, dozen years or so, there was always that fear that it would burn out. Hey, this is really great, but it won't last. People will get tired of hearing these records, that kind of thing. And so it probably took for me, Ron, well into the 90s and sustained successes to realize that, this format's going to be okay. It's real, and it can stand on its own. But all that said, I mean, there's a lot of really crappy classic rock stations out there, and they're not doing particularly well. I mean, you still have to do the basics right. I mean, you still need good personalities, and you need a morning show, and you need to market. I mean, sometimes when a new format takes off, broadcasters would delude themselves that, the format's just going to go on just because the music's so great. And especially today when music has become such a commodity, you don't have to sit around with your cassette recorder listening to a radio station to record a song anymore. You can pull up Spotify anytime you want and hear that song. So what does a classic rock station do for you in 2023 that you can't get from Spotify? I mean, that's the question my stations are asking now. And that's, in many ways, a much bigger challenge than it was back in the 80s